They said he was just a name in an obituary, just another folded flag and pair of empty boots under a tent on a chilly spring morning. That's what the man in the gray windbreaker muttered, half laughing, as he lit a cigarette behind the chapel and told someone on his phone that he was only here for the snacks. He didn't know the man in the casket, Staff Sergeant Lionel Hale, two-time Bronze Star recipient, demolitions expert, combat medic, father of three, and he certainly didn't know the woman who stood trembling beside it, Margaret Hale, 61. Shoulders square with a kind of mourning that only comes after 34 years of watching someone return from war, but never quite make it home. She hadn't expected many to come. Just a modest service at St. Martin's, no press, no procession, just a flag, a hymn, and a man buried with more silence than ceremony. But when that same man in the gray windbreaker chuckled, after she mentioned Lionel's Bronze Star in her eulogy, when he leaned to his buddy and said, "Guess they'll hand those out to anyone now, huh?" The air itself seemed to still. There was no outburst, no gasp, no challenge. Just a kind of breathless stillness, like the room was holding something back. And before we go further, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe some legacies are too sacred to mock, then like and subscribe, because this story, it deserves to be remembered. Now, back to that moment. Margaret's hand gripped the edge of the podium. You could see her knuckles whitening, but her voice didn't break. She kept speaking. She kept honoring him. She talked about how he once drove through an ambush outside Kandahar just to retrieve wounded allies, how he never spoke about what it cost him until the night he woke up screaming, soaked in sweat, thinking he was still in that firestorm. And yet, even then, Glenn Dorrance, because that was the man's name, shifted noisily in his chair, audibly sipping from a plastic coffee cup and muttering about people milking sympathy. Nobody confronted him. Not the priest. Not the other mourners. It's a strange thing, how even in a room full of grief, people are afraid of confrontation. But Margaret just looked at him only once, as if memorizing him. Then she looked at the casket. You could see it then, the strength it took to turn back to her notes, to keep reading the last words she'd written for a man who never once asked the world for recognition. She finished, stepped down, and sat alone. The room tried to settle, tried to pretend it hadn't happened. But something was already shifting. Because seated in the very last row, quiet as a shadow, was a woman in a dark coat and polished boots who hadn't spoken a word since she arrived, and who most hadn't even recognized. It was only when she stood, slow and deliberate, that people began to murmur. Whispers, glances. A few stood instinctively as if something in their training kicked in. Because now they realized who she was. Governor Rebecca Lynn, retired lieutenant colonel, former commander of the 43rd Tactical Response Unit, Lionel Hale's commanding officer during his last tour. She didn't ask to speak. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked forward, past Glenn without a glance, and stood by the casket like she belonged there, because she did. Then she spoke, not to the crowd, but to Margaret. "He saved my life," she said, voice low but ironclad. "I was pinned in a convoy outside Marja, and your husband pulled me out of a burning vehicle with his bare hands. I still have the scars." He never mentioned it. Not once. Now the room was silent in the way that changes people. "That medal you spoke of," she added, turning now to Glenn, who looked pale. "He didn't receive it for existing. He received it for running toward a blast that he knew could kill him, and he did it anyway." And then she paused, the silence taut like a drawn bowstring. "Some people die once. Others die every night when they close their eyes." She placed her hand on the casket. "He never asked to be called a hero. But if anyone dares laugh in the presence of one again, he'll answer to me." Glenn tried to shrink into his chair. But it was too late. The room had shifted. The moment had shifted. What began as a quiet funeral turned into a reckoning. Not because Margaret demanded justice, but because the man who lay in that casket had earned a silence so deep, even a governor stood to defend it. They thought it was over after the governor spoke, that maybe her words were enough to stitch the service back together, smooth over the disrespect like a wrinkle ironed flat. But the truth is, some damage leaves a scar, no matter how quiet the apology. The silence that followed her speech wasn't peaceful. It was surgical, sharp, precise. Glenn Dorrance didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The weight of 50 eyes pressing down on him spoke more than any reprimand could. The priest tried to resume the service, voice quivering slightly as he read Psalm 23, but even he kept glancing toward the casket like it held more than a body, like it held judgment. Margaret sat still, her hands clasped in her lap, the folded flag beside her untouched. She hadn't cried yet. Not once. but her jaw was locked tight, and behind her glasses, something unreadable brewed in her stare. You could tell she wasn't thinking about Glenn anymore. She was somewhere else entirely, on a dusty tarmac in Texas when Lionel first shipped out. Or maybe the night he came home limping and wouldn't talk about what had happened, only said, "We lost a lot of good ones today, and I'm just trying not to forget them." People always assume grief makes you crumble, but sometimes it makes you straighten your spine and freeze, because if you start unraveling, you don't know if you'll ever stop. That was Margaret. And just when we all thought the tension had reached its peak, when the casket was being carried out to the gravesite and the honor guard lined up in polished black dress uniforms, something else happened. It started with a single vehicle, a black Suburban, unmarked, tinted windows. It pulled up beside the chapel without ceremony, without flash. But Governor Lynn turned the moment it arrived. Her entire posture changed, rigid, alert. She didn't look surprised. She looked resolved, like she'd been waiting for this. The door opened, and out stepped 3 figures. One in a blue wool military trench coat with silver trim and a white folder in hand. The second in a plain civilian suit, eyes scanning the crowd like he was mapping the battlefield. And the third, an older woman in a Marine Corps dress uniform, ribbons gleaming like fire in sunlight, chest broad, spine straighter than any of the 20-something honor guards standing nearby. General Cynthia Marlowe. If the governor was iron, Marlowe was stone. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Is that the one from Operation Bastion?" Because everyone knew her name, even if they didn't know why. She'd led Joint Task Force strikes in 3 theaters, had a Purple Heart and 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, and more importantly, she never showed up anywhere without purpose. Governor Lynn stepped toward her first. They didn't salute. They didn't shake hands. They just exchanged a look, the kind shared by people who've bled under the same flag. Marlowe turned her attention to Margaret, who was now standing, unsure, the weight of attention building again. "Ma'am," the general said, voice deep and clear, "we're here because your husband was never properly honored, and I will not let his service end in silence." She handed over the folder. "This is a classified commendation that was only declassified this month. It includes records from Operation Glassfall. Your husband was one of 5 who volunteered to walk into a zone the CIA considered unrecoverable. He carried out 3 wounded, lost hearing in 1 ear, and refused evac until his team was safe. The citation inside is signed by the former Joint Chiefs. He never told you because men like him don't need recognition, but they deserve it anyway." Margaret opened the folder with shaking hands. The first page was a commendation. The second, a scanned letter written in Lionel's own handwriting, addressed to her. "In case this ever finds you," it began. The third page bore his final battlefield briefing photo. He looked younger, exhausted, but steady, the same face she kissed goodnight for 30 years. And still, Margaret said nothing. She looked at the photo, then at the general, and then, finally, at Glenn. And that's when she did something none of us expected. She walked over. She walked right up to the man who mocked her, folded the folder closed, and handed it to him. "Read this," she said. "Then explain to me what you found funny." Glenn didn't take it. He just stared, frozen, like maybe he realized the weight of what he'd touched without knowing. Margaret tucked the folder back under her arm and turned away. Not angry, just done. And sometimes, that's worse. The honor guard began the 21-gun salute moments later. Crisp shots split the air. The sound echoed against the cemetery stones like ghosts clearing their throats. The flag was presented. The bugle played. And this time, nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Because now we all knew. This wasn't just a funeral. It was a moment. A reckoning. And it wasn't finished yet. They say some funerals fade when the last note of taps dies in the wind, when the crowd shuffles off to potlucks and polite condolences. But this one didn't fade. It expanded. It echoed. By the time the casket was lowered and the last shell casing was tucked into Margaret Hale's palm, people weren't just whispering about the service, they were calling it something else entirely, a moment that stopped time. Margaret stood motionless beside the grave, flag in one arm, the declassified folder in the other, but something in her posture had shifted. Not grief exactly. Something older, deeper. Closure with teeth. The wind picked up, curling around the chapel like a reminder, and as people turned to leave, another vehicle arrived. This time it wasn't black or unmarked. It was the state government's armored SUV with two flags flanking the grille, state and national, and when the door opened, the last surprise of the day stepped into the light. Governor Lynn walked back toward the gathering, not alone now, but with a group of student cadets in full dress blues from the State Military Academy. They marched silently behind her in two perfect columns, hands folded behind their backs. Glenn Dorrance, who'd spent the last half hour pretending to check emails behind a tree, looked up and froze when he saw them. Governor Lynn didn't go to the podium. She didn't need one. She stood on the grass beside Lionel's grave, nodded to Margaret, and turned to the now dwindling crowd, voice calm, firm, and cutting through the wind like a command. "This wasn't supposed to be public," she said. "I came to pay respects to a man who never asked for credit. But disrespect has a way of forcing history's hand." She paused just long enough for every eye to settle on Glenn, though she never said his name. "I served under Staff Sergeant Lionel Hale in 2003. He didn't just save my life in Marja, he saved the mission. He was the reason half of Task Force 17 made it out alive. We all carry scars, but Hale carried something heavier: accountability. He never boasted, never embellished. And when he came home, he volunteered with wounded vets until the arthritis in his hands made it too painful to even hold a coffee cup." The cadets behind her stood straighter. One stepped forward, a young man, maybe 20, blonde hair and steel in his eyes, and presented a small glass case to Margaret. Inside, Lionel's final Bronze Star and a ribbon strip meant for uniform display. "We found this in storage," the cadet said, voice steady. He refused a ceremony. Said it should go to someone who still had time to make a difference. "But the general says it belongs with his family." Margaret took it without a word, and for a moment the silence returned, but this time it felt like reverence, not avoidance. And just as everyone thought the service had reached its end, the priest stepped forward and cleared his throat. "There's one last request in Sergeant Hale's funeral pre-file," he said, unfolding a paper. Apparently he asked that someone read this letter, if and only if certain people were present. A few eyebrows raised. The priest handed the paper to Governor Lynn. She scanned it, nodded, then looked up with a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "He wrote this 20 years ago," she said. "Long before any of us imagined this day." She began reading aloud. "To whoever is standing at my grave, don't cry because I'm gone. Cry if you forget what we stood for. I don't need a monument. I don't need a folded flag. I just need you to remember that decency is a choice. That silence in the face of cruelty is its own form of betrayal. And if anyone ever laughs at a woman in black, remind them that love leaves behind more courage than shame ever could." The crowd didn't breathe. Margaret stood motionless. Glenn, still half hidden behind the tree, had nothing left to say. And then, without instruction, without any word spoken, the entire line of cadets snapped into a crisp salute. One by one, the remaining mourners, officers, civilians, veterans, even the priest, followed suit. And Glenn? He didn't move. Not out of defiance, but out of paralysis. Because now, finally, he understood the weight of what he'd mocked. He didn't just laugh at a eulogy. He laughed at a life that had held more integrity in a quiet mourning than Glenn had known his whole adult existence. As the last notes of the ceremony faded and the grave was covered, Margaret walked past Glenn, slow, unhurried, calm. She didn't spit venom or raise her voice. She just stopped beside him, held out the folder with Lionel's handwritten letter on top, and said, "I think you should keep this, so you never forget what a man looks like." Then she walked away. Governor Lynn caught up to her moments later, placing a firm hand on her shoulder, and together they exited through the chapel gates. The cadets followed. The Suburban pulled away, and in the distance, where Glenn still stood, folder in hand and shame thick in his throat, one could almost hear Lionel Hale's legacy settling into the earth like a lesson carved into stone. This wasn't just a funeral. This was a warning, a reminder, that some men live quiet so that others might speak loudly in their memory. And some moments demand more than mourning, they demand accountability. That day, the wind carried more than sorrow. It carried change. And nobody laughed again.